In Ohio's industrial heartland, where chemical plants tower over Lake Erie's shores, some disappearances expose dangerous secrets. On the shores of Lake Erie, in the industrial heart of Ashtabula County, Ohio, the ChemCore Industries processing plant operates around the clock. The facility stretches across 400 acres of waterfront land, its maze of pipes, reactors, and storage tanks casting long shadows under the harsh sodium lights that never go dark. By October 2019, Ashtabula had seen better days. Once a thriving steel town with a bustling port, the city had watched factory after factory close their doors over the past 3 decades. The chemical plant remained one of the few major employers, processing petrochemicals and industrial solvents for companies across the Great Lakes region. For the 800 workers who still called it home, ChemCore represented steady paychecks in an uncertain economy. Marcus Kowalski knew every inch of that facility. At 51, he had worked the graveyard shift for 28 years, starting as a maintenance tech, fresh out of high school, and working his way up to shift supervisor. His colleagues respected him for his steady demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge of plant operations. His superiors valued his ability to keep production running smoothly through the night hours when management was nowhere to be found. On the evening of October 15, 2019, Marcus arrived at work at his usual time. 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his shift officially began. Security cameras captured him badging through the main entrance, exchanging brief pleasantries with the day shift supervisor, and making his way to the control room in Building A. He carried his standard equipment: hard hat, safety glasses, radio, and the worn leather portfolio where he kept his shift notes and safety documentation. The first 3 hours passed routinely. Plant logs show normal production levels across all 5 reactor buildings. Marcus conducted his standard hourly walkthroughs, checking pressure gauges, temperature readings, and safety systems. His radio communications with the control room were brief and professional, the kind of efficient exchanges that marked a supervisor confident in his work. At 11:23 p.m., that routine was shattered. An automated alarm triggered in Reactor Building C, indicating a pressure anomaly in the secondary cooling system. The plant's emergency protocols immediately activated a Level 2 chemical containment procedure, serious enough to require immediate supervisor response, but not severe enough to evacuate the facility. Marcus acknowledged the alarm over his radio. His voice, according to the recordings later reviewed by investigators, remained calm and focused. "Control, this is Marcus. I'm heading to Building C to assess the situation. Initiating Protocol 7 containment procedure." Protocol 7 was familiar territory for an experienced supervisor like Marcus. It required a visual inspection of the affected systems, manual pressure readings from backup gauges, and a systematic shutdown of non-essential equipment in the building. Under normal circumstances, the procedure took between 45 minutes to an hour to complete. But on this night, something went terribly wrong. Surveillance footage from the exterior of Reactor Building C shows Marcus entering through the south entrance at 11:31 p.m. and his keycard registered access to the main floor at 11:33, then to the elevated walkway system at 11:39, and finally to the control substation at 11:47 p.m. on O. After that moment, Marcus Kowalski simply vanished. His keycard never registered another access. His radio went silent, and when the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., they found his post abandoned, the emergency protocol incomplete, and no sign of where their veteran supervisor had gone. What happened during those crucial minutes in Reactor Building C would become one of Ohio's most puzzling industrial mysteries, a case that would expose corporate cover-ups, environmental crimes, and the dangerous reality of speaking truth to power in America's chemical corridor. To understand what happened to Marcus Kowalski, it's essential to understand Protocol 7, the emergency containment procedure that drew him into Reactor Building C that night. ChemCore's emergency protocols were developed over decades of industrial operations and refined through bitter experience. Protocol 7 specifically addressed pressure anomalies in secondary cooling systems, a relatively common occurrence that could indicate anything from a minor valve malfunction to a potentially catastrophic system failure. The procedure required a hands-on assessment that only a qualified supervisor could perform. According to plant documentation, Protocol 7 followed a strict sequence. First, the responding supervisor would conduct a visual inspection of all cooling system components. Second, they would manually verify pressure readings using backup analog gauges, a safeguard against electronic sensor failures. Third, they would systematically isolate and shut down non-essential equipment to reduce system stress. Finally, they would radio their findings to the control room and either authorize system restart or call for maintenance crews. The entire process typically took between 45 minutes to an hour. Marcus had performed Protocol 7 dozens of times throughout his career. Plant records show he had successfully handled similar emergencies on at least 37 previous occasions, always following procedure to the letter. On October 15th, Marcus's radio communications during the first 20 minutes followed the expected pattern. At 11:35 p.m., he reported normal visual conditions in the primary cooling loop. At 11:41, he confirmed that manual pressure readings matched the electronic displays, ruling out sensor malfunction as the cause of the alarm. At 11:46, he announced that he was beginning the equipment isolation sequence. "Control, pressure is holding steady at the manual gauges," his voice crackled over the radio. "Beginning shutdown sequence for non-essential systems. Should have this wrapped up in 20 minutes. Those were the last words anyone heard from Marcus Kowalski. Surveillance footage provides crucial insights into his movements that night, at least initially. The camera mounted above the south entrance to Building C shows Marcus entering at 11:31, carrying his standard equipment and moving with his characteristic purposeful stride. Interior cameras tracked his progress through the facility's maze of walkways and platforms. At 11:33, he appears on the main floor camera, consulting what appears to be a handheld device, likely a digital pressure reader. At 11:39, he's visible on the elevated walkway camera, 40 feet above the reactor floor, methodically checking valve positions. At 11:47, the control substation camera captures him entering the equipment room that housed the manual override controls. Then, the surveillance system experienced what would become the most controversial aspect of the entire case. A 23-minute gap exists in the surveillance coverage of Reactor Building C's interior spaces. From 11:47 p.m. until 12:10 a.m., several interior cameras experienced what plant technicians later described as synchronous malfunction. They all stopped recording simultaneously, then resumed normal operation. When pressed by investigators, ChemCore's security director, Tom Brennan, acknowledged that such widespread camera failures were extremely rare. "In 15 years of managing the security system," he stated in his official interview, "I can count on one hand the number of times we've had multiple cameras fail at once. It's just not how these systems work." The timing of the camera failure was particularly suspicious. The outage began exactly 16 minutes after Marcus had entered Building C, and ended precisely when his shift would normally conclude routine emergency protocols. The cameras resumed recording at 12:10 a.m., showing empty corridors and inactive equipment, but no sign of Marcus. Most puzzling of all, the emergency protocol he had started was never completed. The non-essential equipment he was supposed to isolate remained running throughout the night. Plant logs show that the pressure anomaly that triggered the initial alarm resolved itself sometime around midnight, well within normal parameters for this type of system fluctuation. Under any other circumstances, Marcus would have completed the protocol, filed his report, and returned to his normal duties. His 28-year safety record showed a man who never left a job half-finished, never abandoned his post, and never failed to follow proper procedures. When investigators examined the control substation where Marcus was last seen, they found his leather portfolio sitting on a desk, open to his shift notes. The last entry was time-stamped 11:46 p.m. Pressure readings normal. Beginning equipment isolation. His handwriting was steady and showed no signs of distress. The room itself showed no evidence of struggle, accident, or emergency. Equipment was in normal operating condition. Safety systems were functioning properly. Temperature and atmospheric readings were within acceptable ranges. Nothing suggested why an experienced supervisor would suddenly abandon a critical safety procedure. Plant records indicate that Marcus's keycard stopped registering access after 11:47 p.m. But the facility's card reader system was designed to track all movement through secured areas. For Marcus to leave Building C, he would have had to use his keycard to exit through any of the secured doors. No such exit was recorded. The mystery deepened when investigators learned that Building C had only 3 ways in or out: the main entrance where Marcus had entered, an emergency exit that would trigger alarms if opened, and a service tunnel that connected to the facility's central maintenance area. All 3 access points required keycard authorization, and none showed any activity after Marcus's final recorded entry at 11:47. Somewhere in those missing 23 minutes during the convenient camera malfunction, Marcus Kowalski had vanished from a secured industrial facility without triggering any of the sophisticated monitoring systems designed to track every person's movement. What happened during that gap in surveillance would become the central question in a case that would ultimately expose far more than just a missing person mystery. When the day shift supervisor, Janet Coleman, arrived at ChemCore at 6:30 a.m. on October 16th, she expected a routine handoff from Marcus Kowalski. Instead, she found the night shift control room empty, emergency lights still flashing in Building C, and no sign of the facility's most reliable supervisor. Coleman immediately initiated the plant's missing person protocol. She ordered a personnel count of all night shift workers and dispatched security to check the parking lot. What they discovered there would add another layer to the mystery. Marcus's blue 2014 Ford F-150 sat running in the employee parking lot, positioned in his usual spot near the main entrance. The truck's engine was warm, the radio tuned to 1420, the local news station Marcus listened to every morning. His coffee mug sat in the center console, still containing traces of warmth. The driver's door was slightly ajar, as if someone had exited quickly. Inside the truck, investigators would later find Marcus's wallet containing $127 in cash and all of his credit cards. His cell phone lay on the passenger seat, showing several missed calls from his wife Linda, who had been trying to reach him since 6:30 a.m. But his work equipment, hard hat, safety glasses, and radio, were nowhere to be found. By 7:15 a.m., plant security had completed a preliminary search of all common areas. Marcus was nowhere to be found. Security Director Tom Brennan made the decision to contact law enforcement at 7:45 a.m. The Ashtabula County Sheriff's Office received the call at 8:02 a.m. and dispatched Deputy Sarah Rodriguez to the scene. By 8:30, Rodriguez had interviewed Janet Coleman and reviewed the available surveillance footage, what little existed after the mysterious camera malfunction. At 9:15, she officially classified Marcus's disappearance as a missing person case, noting in her report the unusual circumstances surrounding the incident. This wasn't someone who just walked off the job, Rodriguez later explained. Mr. Kowalski was known for his reliability. He'd been with the company for nearly 3 decades. People like that don't just vanish without explanation, especially not during an emergency procedure. Sheriff Michael Kowalski, no relation to Marcus, despite sharing the common Polish surname, authorized a comprehensive search operation at 10 a.m. IO. The 400-acre facility presented significant challenges. 5 major buildings connected by a maze of outdoor piping, storage tanks the size of houses, and restricted areas containing hazardous materials that required specialized equipment to access safely. The sheriff's office brought in search dogs and requested assistance from the county's industrial accident response team. The search teams worked systematically through each building, checking maintenance tunnels, equipment rooms, storage areas, and emergency shelters. They examined every space where someone might take shelter, become trapped, or suffer an accident. We treated this as both a missing person case and a potential industrial accident, Sheriff Kowalski explained at a press conference 3 days later. These facilities have inherent dangers. Our first priority was determining if Mr. Kowalski had suffered some kind of medical emergency or workplace injury. But as the hours passed, the search revealed no trace of Marcus. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. The industrial search teams, experienced in navigating chemical facilities, were puzzled by the complete absence of evidence. Then, late on the afternoon of October 16th, maintenance worker Carlos Vasquez made a discovery that would shift the entire investigation. Vasquez was checking storm drains in the facility's southeastern section, part of the routine inspection that followed any emergency incident. 30 feet from the main processing area, partially hidden beneath a metal grate, he spotted something that shouldn't have been there: Marcus's distinctive yellow hard hat. The helmet showed no signs of damage, but its location raised immediate questions. The drainage culvert was part of the plant's environmental containment system, designed to prevent chemical runoff from reaching Lake Erie. Access to the area was strictly controlled and required special authorization. According to plant records, Marcus had no scheduled business in that section of the facility. More importantly, the culvert was nearly 200 yards from Reactor Building C, where Marcus was last seen. The route between the two locations would have required passing through multiple secured areas, each requiring keycard access that would have been logged in the system. Finding that hard hat opened up a whole new set of questions, Deputy Rodriguez noted in her supplemental report. How did it get there? Why would Mr. Kowalski have been in that area? And if he did go there, what happened next? The discovery prompted an expanded search focusing on the plant's perimeter and the drainage systems that connected to Lake Erie. Divers from the county rescue team examined the underwater outfall pipes, while additional ground teams searched the shoreline and nearby wetlands. They found no additional evidence. Despite these intensive efforts, no trace of Marcus himself was discovered. His radio, safety glasses, and other personal equipment remained missing. His keycard, which should have been clipped to his shirt, was never recovered. Most puzzling of all, there was no explanation for how his hard hat had ended up in a restricted area he had no reason to visit. By the end of the first week, the sheriff's office had interviewed 37 plant employees, reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and searched every accessible area of the facility twice. They had brought in cadaver dogs, thermal imaging equipment, and specialized industrial search teams. The result was always the same. Marcus Kowalski had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a single piece of safety equipment in a place where it should never have been found. Marcus Kowalski wasn't just another shift supervisor at ChemCore Industries. For the past 6 years, he'd served as the unofficial voice of the plant's workers, a role that had earned him both respect among his colleagues and scrutiny from management. In the break room conversations and parking lot gatherings that define industrial work culture, Marcus was the one workers turned to when safety protocols were bypassed, or when overtime policies were ignored. Though he held no official union title, ChemCore had successfully resisted unionization efforts for decades. Everyone knew Marcus was the man who would speak up when others couldn't afford to. That reputation had grown more complicated in recent months. ChemCore had announced layoffs in August 2019, cutting 37 positions from the plant's workforce of 815. The cuts weren't random. Several long-term employees who'd raised safety concerns found themselves on the list, including 2 who'd filed complaints with OSHA the previous spring. Marcus had been vocal about the layoffs, questioning management's priorities in a heated meeting with plant director Robert Hensley on September 12th. According to maintenance worker Dave Petrusky, who was present for part of the discussion, Marcus had accused management of cutting corners that'll get somebody hurt. The meeting lasted nearly an hour, with voices audible through Hensley's office door. But Marcus's advocacy went deeper than workplace grievances. His daughter Rachel, a nursing student at Kent State University, revealed after his disappearance that her father had been documenting what he saw as dangerous shortcuts in plant operations. For months, Marcus had been photographing safety equipment that needed repair, recording instances where proper protocols were skipped, and noting chemicals that were stored improperly. Dad kept a notebook, Rachel told investigators during her interview on October 22nd. He said somebody needed to keep track, because the company sure wasn't going to do it honestly. The notebook, a small composition book with a blue cover, was never found among Marcus's belongings or in his work area. The documentation wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Marcus had confided to his wife Linda that he believed the plant was headed for a serious accident. The emergency shutdown on October 15th involved a chemical reactor that Marcus had specifically flagged in his notes. According to Rachel, he'd photographed corroded seals on Reactor Building C's containment systems just 2 weeks before his disappearance. Other workers confirmed Marcus's growing concerns. Jerry Kowalski, a quality control technician who'd worked alongside Marcus for 15 years, described his friend's increasing frustration with management. Marcus used to joke around, but the last few months he was different, more serious. He'd point out problems and management would just brush him off. The tension had escalated in early October when Marcus discovered that environmental monitoring equipment had been reporting false readings for at least 3 months. The sensors that tracked chemical discharge into the Ashtabula River had been calibrated incorrectly, potentially hiding violations of the plant's EPA permit. Marcus had confronted his supervisor, Assistant Plant Manager Carol Stevens, about the discrepancy on October 3rd. Stevens later told investigators that Marcus had been increasingly difficult to manage and seemed to be looking for problems where none existed. But maintenance records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request told a different story. The monitoring equipment had indeed been malfunctioning, and repairs had been delayed repeatedly due to budget constraints. For Marcus, the malfunctioning monitors weren't just a regulatory problem. They were a betrayal of the community he'd lived in his entire life. Born and raised in Ashtabula, he'd seen what industrial contamination could do to a lakefront town. His own father had worked at Republic Steel until lung disease forced early retirement. Marcus wasn't going to watch ChemCore make the same mistakes. The situation came to a head 2 days before his disappearance. On October 13th, Marcus made a 14-minute phone call to the EPA's regional office in Chicago. The call was logged in the agency's records, though the content of the conversation remains confidential. EPA Compliance Officer Sarah Chen later confirmed that Marcus had requested a meeting to discuss serious concerns about plant operations. The meeting was scheduled for October 28th. Marcus never made it. Other workers at the plant noticed changes in Marcus's behavior during his final weeks. He arrived earlier for his shifts, stayed later to complete documentation, and seemed more focused on details that others might overlook. Maintenance Supervisor Carl Henderson observed that Marcus had been spending more time in areas of the plant that weren't typically part of his rounds. Marcus knew that place better than anybody, Henderson explained to investigators. If he was poking around in new areas, he had a reason. Marcus didn't waste time on things that didn't matter. On the night he vanished, Marcus arrived for a shift at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes early as was his habit. Security footage shows him talking briefly with day shift supervisor Tom Bradley near the main entrance. Their conversation appeared routine, but Bradley would later tell investigators that Marcus seemed more focused than usual, like he had something important on his mind. What Marcus had on his mind that night, whether it was the emergency shutdown, his documentation of safety violations, or his upcoming meeting with federal regulators, remains unknown. But one thing was clear: Marcus Kowalski had become more than just a shift supervisor. In the eyes of some, he'd become a problem that needed to be solved. The question that haunted investigators was whether someone at ChemCore had decided to solve that problem permanently. In the dangerous world of industrial whistleblowing, speaking truth to power could be a deadly proposition, especially when millions of dollars in regulatory fines and criminal liability hung in the balance. EPA Compliance Officer Sarah Chen had been monitoring ChemCore Industries for 3 years when Marcus Kowalski disappeared. What she'd discovered in that time painted a troubling picture of a company systematically cutting environmental corners to maintain profits. Chen, based in the EPA's Region 5 office in Chicago, specialized in industrial discharge violations along the Great Lakes. ChemCore's Ashtabula facility had appeared on her radar in 2016, following complaints from local environmental groups about discolored water in the Ashtabula River downstream from the plant. Her first inspection, conducted on March 14, 2017, revealed multiple violations of the plant's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. Chemical levels in the plant's discharge exceeded federal limits for copper, zinc, and several organic compounds. The violations weren't enormous, falling within what EPA guidelines classify as moderate infractions, but they were consistent, suggesting systemic problems rather than isolated incidents. ChemCore's response had been typical of companies facing environmental scrutiny: acknowledge the problems, blame equipment failures, promise improvements, and negotiate reduced penalties. The company paid a $180,000 fine and agreed to upgrade its water treatment systems by December 2017. But the upgrades were incomplete and poorly maintained. Chen's follow-up inspection in June 2018 found that new equipment had been installed but wasn't functioning properly. Monitoring systems designed to track discharge levels were providing inconsistent readings, and plant personnel seemed confused about proper operating procedures. It was clear they'd spent money on equipment without investing in proper training or maintenance, Chen explained in her official report. The technology was there, but the commitment to environmental compliance wasn't. More concerning were the gaps in ChemCore's environmental documentation. Federal regulations require chemical plants to maintain detailed records of all discharge monitoring, including daily readings from automated sensors and weekly manual testing. ChemCore's records showed suspicious patterns, periods where all readings fell conveniently within acceptable ranges, followed by sudden spikes that triggered equipment malfunctions. Chen had seen this pattern before at other facilities. Companies would manipulate monitoring systems to hide violations, then claim equipment failure when actual testing revealed problems. Proving intentional manipulation required extensive investigation, something EPA's limited resources made difficult to pursue. That changed on October 13, 2019, when Marcus Kowalski called Chen's direct office line. The conversation, logged in EPA records as lasting 14 minutes, covered what Chen described in her notes as significant concerns about monitoring equipment and potential falsification of discharge data. Marcus told Chen he had documentation of equipment problems that management had ignored for months. More importantly, he claimed to have evidence that monitoring systems were being deliberately miscalibrated to hide violations. Marcus requested a meeting to turn over his documentation and provide testimony about ChemCore's environmental practices. Chen scheduled the meeting for October 28, noting in her calendar that Marcus seemed knowledgeable about technical systems and genuinely concerned about environmental impact. She'd planned to bring a criminal enforcement specialist to the meeting, given the potential for intentional regulatory violations. Marcus never made it to that meeting. After Marcus's disappearance became public, Chen immediately contacted ChemCore's management to request preservation of all environmental monitoring records. The company's response, delivered through their legal department, claimed that routine data management had already archived older records, and that retrieving them would require significant time and resources. When Chen finally gained access to ChemCore's environmental monitoring systems on November 8, nearly a month after Marcus vanished, she discovered that data files for September and October had been corrupted during a system upgrade performed on October 20, 5 days after Marcus disappeared. The timing struck Chen as highly suspicious. In my experience, companies don't perform major system upgrades during active investigations unless they have something to hide, she noted in her inspection report. What Chen did find troubled her even more. Physical inspection of the monitoring equipment revealed that sensors had been deliberately recalibrated to provide readings that were consistently 15 to 20% lower than actual chemical levels. The recalibration had been done professionally, requiring technical knowledge that suggested inside involvement. ChemCore's environmental manager, Dr. Patricia Voss, claimed the recalibration was part of routine maintenance performed by an outside contractor. But when Chen requested documentation of the maintenance work, the company couldn't provide contracts, invoices, or even the name of the contractor who'd performed the work. Meanwhile, Chen's investigation expanded beyond ChemCore's facility. Water quality testing in the Ashtabula River showed elevated levels of industrial chemicals dating back several months, suggesting that violations had been ongoing longer than company records indicated. Fish kills reported by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources in August and September aligned with periods when ChemCore's monitoring systems would have been providing false readings. Local environmental activist Janet Morrison had been documenting water quality issues near ChemCore for years. Her photographs showed discolored discharge from plant outflow pipes, dead vegetation along the riverbank, and foam accumulation in areas where treated water entered the river. "We've been telling the EPA for months that something wasn't right," Morrison explained during a November interview with investigators. The company kept saying their monitoring showed everything was fine, but anybody with eyes could see the river was being damaged. Morrison's documentation took on new significance after Marcus disappeared. Her photographs from October 12th, 3 days before Marcus vanished, showed unusual activity at ChemCore's discharge outflow, including what appeared to be emergency pumping operations during evening hours when monitoring was typically less stringent. Chen's investigation revealed a pattern of environmental violations that went far beyond simple equipment malfunctions. The evidence suggested deliberate manipulation of monitoring systems, falsification of discharge data, and systematic concealment of regulatory violations. The potential criminal liability was enormous. Environmental crimes at this scale could result in millions of dollars in fines and prison sentences for responsible corporate officers. Chen's final inspection report, submitted to EPA headquarters on January 15, 2020, concluded that ChemCore Industries had likely been violating federal environmental regulations for months through deliberate manipulation of monitoring equipment. The report recommended criminal investigation and substantial financial penalties. But by then, Marcus Kowalski, the man who might have provided crucial testimony about the company's environmental crimes, had been missing for 3 months. The documentation he'd promised to share with Chen was never found, and the answers to what happened during those 23 minutes in Reactor Building C remained as elusive as the chemicals that continued flowing into the Ashtabula River. The case had become more than just a missing person investigation. It was now a federal environmental crime case with a potential witness who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, circumstances that grew more suspicious with each piece of evidence that Chen uncovered. ChemCore Industries' response to Marcus Kowalski's disappearance was swift, comprehensive, and suspicious in its efficiency. Within 18 hours of Marcus being reported missing, the company had retained Caldwell & Associates, Cleveland's most expensive crisis management firm. By the morning of October 17th, less than 2 days after the incident, ChemCore had prepared a detailed media statement, established a family liaison protocol, and begun what they termed full cooperation with law enforcement. The official statement, released to local media at 2 p.m. on October 17th, described Marcus as a valued employee and dedicated family man who had encountered an unfortunate accident during routine emergency procedures. The statement emphasized ChemCore's excellent safety record and immediate implementation of additional security measures to prevent similar incidents. What the statement didn't mention was more revealing than what it did. No reference to the ongoing EPA investigation. No acknowledgement of recent workplace tensions. No explanation for why routine emergency procedures would result in a missing employee. The carefully crafted language suggested a company more concerned with protecting its reputation than finding its missing supervisor. Behind the carefully crafted public messaging, ChemCore was taking more aggressive steps to control the narrative. On October 19th, Plant Director Robert Hensley met individually with key employees, including several who had worked closely with Marcus. According to maintenance technician Dave Petrusky, the meetings weren't exactly interviews. Hensley made it real clear that talking to reporters or investigators without company lawyers present would be problematic for our employment status. Petrusky later told county investigators. He said the company was committed to finding Marcus, but that wild theories and rumors would only hurt the investigation. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation meant staying silent. ChemCore's most surprising move came on October 25th, just 10 days after Marcus vanished. Company representatives contacted Marcus's wife Linda through an intermediary, offering what they described as emergency financial assistance while the search continued. The assistance package was remarkably generous. ChemCore offered to continue Marcus's salary and benefits indefinitely, cover all search-related expenses, and provide a lump sum payment of $250,000 to help the family during this difficult time. The only requirement was signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would prevent Linda or her children from discussing the case with media, investigators, or attorneys. Linda Kowalski refused the offer. They wanted to buy my silence before they even knew if Marcus was dead or alive, Linda told investigators during her November 3rd interview. That told me everything I needed to know about what really happened to my husband. ChemCore's legal strategy extended to the physical evidence as well. On October 30th, the company's insurance carrier commissioned an independent investigation of the incident, hiring Midwest industrial safety consultants to conduct what they termed a comprehensive facility review. The review was anything but independent. MISC was owned by a subsidiary of ChemCore's parent company, Consolidated Chemical Holdings. The investigation team had full access to plant facilities, employee records, and security systems, access that was significantly broader than what they provided to county investigators. MISC's preliminary report, completed on November 15th, concluded that Marcus had likely suffered acute disorientation during the emergency response and had accidentally accessed an unauthorized area of the facility. The report suggested that Marcus had fallen into one of the plant's drainage systems and been washed into Lake Erie through industrial discharge pipes. The theory had one major problem. It didn't explain the surveillance footage gaps. Security camera coverage in Reactor Building C had experienced what ChemCore's department described as a routine maintenance outage between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. on October 15th, exactly the period when Marcus was in the building. The outage affected 12 cameras throughout the facility's most sensitive areas. According to ChemCore's head of security, former police detective Mike Torino, the maintenance was scheduled months in advance to upgrade camera resolution. But work orders obtained by investigators showed no scheduled maintenance for that date. The upgrade work had been authorized by an emergency work order issued at 11:45 p.m. on October 15th, 15 minutes after Marcus had already entered the building. Torino's explanation for the timing was that emergency situations sometimes required immediate security enhancements. When pressed by investigators about why security cameras would be disabled during an active emergency, Torino's responses became increasingly vague. The camera situation became more suspicious when investigators learned that 3 other ChemCore employees had resigned in the weeks following Marcus's disappearance. All 3 had worked night shifts and had security access to Reactor Building C. Environmental technician Sarah Walsh quit on November 8th, citing family commitments that required her to move to Florida immediately. Security guard James Murphy resigned on November 22nd, accepting a position with a private security firm in Texas. Plant maintenance supervisor Carl Henderson retired early on December 1st, despite being only 54 years old. None of the 3 would speak with investigators before leaving Ohio. Perhaps most tellingly, ChemCore's cooperation with law enforcement was selective. While the company provided employee records and security footage, they claimed attorney-client privilege when investigators requested internal communications about the incident. Emails between plant management, corporate headquarters, and legal counsel remained off-limits. When EPA compliance officer Sarah Chen requested environmental monitoring data for the days surrounding Marcus's disappearance, ChemCore's lawyers argued that the request exceeded EPA's jurisdiction since the incident was being investigated as a missing person case, not an environmental violation. The legal maneuvering bought time for ChemCore to control the investigation narrative. By December, media attention had largely moved on to other stories. The intensive search efforts had been scaled back, and the company's message that Marcus Kowalski had suffered an unfortunate accident during routine work was becoming accepted fact. But questions remained. Why had ChemCore been so quick to offer Marcus's family a substantial settlement? Why had key employees left the area so suddenly? And why were the company's lawyers working so hard to keep internal communications secret? For investigators, ChemCore's response raised more suspicions than it settled. The company's efficiency in managing the crisis seemed less like genuine concern for a missing employee, and more like a well-orchestrated effort to minimize corporate liability and silence potential witnesses to whatever had really happened in those missing 23 minutes. At 7:15 a.m. on October 16, 2019, maintenance worker Jerry Kowalski made a discovery that would deepen the mystery surrounding Marcus Kowalski's disappearance. Marcus's truck, a blue 2014 Ford F-150, sat running in the employee parking lot with the driver's door slightly ajar. The truck was parked in Marcus's usual spot, roughly 50 yards from the main entrance to ChemCore's administrative building. The engine was running. The radio was tuned to AM 1420, the local news station Marcus listened to every morning, and his coffee mug sat in the center console, still warm to the touch. Security footage showed the truck arriving in the parking lot at 6:52 a.m., 23 minutes after Marcus's shift had officially ended. But the cameras, which had experienced their mysterious maintenance outage during the night, didn't show who was driving. Inside the truck, investigators found Marcus's wallet, containing $127 in cash, and all of his credit cards. His cell phone lay on the passenger seat, showing several missed calls from his wife Linda, who had been trying to reach him since 6:30 a.m. The last outgoing call on the phone was to ChemCore's main number at 11:41 p.m. the previous night, 6 minutes before his keycard stopped registering in the facility's access system. But it was what wasn't in the truck that troubled investigators most. Marcus's hard hat, safety glasses, and work gloves, equipment he wore religiously, and never left at the plant, were nowhere to be found. Neither was the small composition notebook his daughter had described, the one where he'd been documenting safety violations. The truck's discovery coincided with unusual readings at Lake Erie monitoring stations operated by the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. On October 16th, sensors at the Ashtabula Harbor Station recorded chemical levels that were nearly double normal ranges. The elevated readings continued for 3 days before returning to baseline levels on October 19th. UEPA water quality specialist Dr. Michael Torres noted the anomaly in his weekly report. The chemical signature was consistent with industrial discharge, but at concentrations that would require either a massive accidental release or deliberate dumping of contaminated material, Torres explained to investigators. The timing of the elevated readings, beginning within hours of Marcus's disappearance, struck investigators as more than coincidental. ChemCore's discharge permit allowed for limited chemical release into the Ashtabula River, which flows directly into Lake Erie at the harbor. But the quantities detected suggested discharge levels far exceeding permit limits. When investigators questioned ChemCore about potential chemical releases on October 15th or 16th, company officials insisted that all discharge had been within permit parameters. Environmental manager Dr. Patricia Voss provided documentation showing normal readings from the plant's monitoring systems during the relevant time period. But the documentation conflicted with OPA's independent measurements. Either ChemCore's monitoring systems were severely malfunctioning, or the company was deliberately concealing unauthorized chemical discharge that coincided precisely with Marcus's disappearance. The discrepancy prompted an anonymous tip that would complicate the investigation further. On November 12th, a caller contacted the Ashtabula County Sheriff's Office claiming to have witnessed unusual activity at ChemCore during the early morning hours of October 16. The caller, whose identity was protected under Ohio's anonymous tip statute, described seeing multiple unmarked tanker trucks at the plant's loading dock around 3:00 a.m., hours before the facility's normal shipping operations began. The trucks appeared to be removing liquid materials from the plant in what the caller described as emergency disposal operations. Deputy Sarah Mitchell, who took the call, noted that the caller seemed knowledgeable about industrial operations and provided specific details about truck configurations and loading procedures. The caller claimed that similar late-night removal operations had been occurring for months, but had increased significantly in recent weeks. Efforts to verify the tip through traffic cameras and truckway station records proved unsuccessful. The loading dock area wasn't covered by ChemCore's security cameras. They focused on personnel entrances and sensitive areas inside the facility, and the company maintained that no unusual shipping activities had occurred on the night in question. Meanwhile, Marcus's family continued their own investigation. His daughter Rachel had begun reviewing her father's personal effects, looking for any clues about what he might have discovered at the plant. In a shoebox stored in Marcus's garage, she found photographs that would raise new questions about ChemCore's operations. The photographs, taken with a digital camera and printed on standard copy paper, showed various areas of the ChemCore facility. Some images depicted corroded equipment and improper chemical storage, the safety violations Marcus had been documenting. But others showed something more concerning: what appeared to be unauthorized dumping of industrial waste into natural areas surrounding the plant. One photograph, dated October 10th according to the camera's timestamp, showed a drainage culvert filled with discolored liquid that was flowing toward the Ashtabula River. Another image captured workers in protective suits, burying what appeared to be chemical containers in a wooded area north of the main facility. Rachel provided the photographs to both county investigators and EPA compliance officer, Sarah Chen. But when investigators attempted to locate the areas shown in the images, they found that recent earth-moving activities had altered the landscape significantly. ChemCore claimed the work was part of routine facility maintenance authorized months earlier. Today, more than 4 years after Marcus Kowalski vanished, his disappearance remains officially classified as a missing person case. The FBI has opened a parallel investigation focusing on potential environmental crimes, but no charges have been filed against ChemCore Industries or any individual employees. Linda Kowalski continues to search for answers about her husband's fate. She has hired a private investigator, established a tip line, and maintains a Facebook page dedicated to finding Marcus. The reward for information leading to his whereabouts has grown to $75,000. Funded by contributions from current and former ChemCore employees, who believe Marcus was silenced for trying to expose environmental crimes. The questions surrounding those 23 missing minutes in Reactor Building C remain unanswered. What did Marcus discover that night? Why were surveillance cameras conveniently offline during the crucial time period? And where's the documentation he had promised to share with federal regulators? On quiet mornings along the Lake Erie shoreline, when the industrial haze lifts and the water seems almost clear, it's easy to forget about the chemicals flowing beneath the surface. But for those who knew Marcus Kowalski, the questions linger like the lake-effect snow that blankets Ashtabula each winter, persistent, cold, and impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the vast industrial landscape of Ohio's chemical corridor, the truth about what happened to Marcus Kowalski remains buried. The only certainty is that a man who spent his career protecting others vanished while trying to protect the community he loved. And that truth, like Marcus himself, may never surface.